Today, we are diving into a topic that most women don't even think about when it comes to their hormones and fertility: environmental toxins, but specifically mold. Today, we are joined by Deidre Bloomquist, a functional nutritionist and the founder of Always Growing Wellness. She is an author, an educator, and a practitioner mentor. You may know to look at estrogen and progesterone, our reproductive hormones, but you may not know that hidden disruptors like mycotoxins coming from mold can disrupt these extremely important hormones. That is why I am so excited to interview Deidre today and really dive into this nuanced topic. So welcome.
Yeah, I'm so excited to chat about this because I wish more people knew that it was something to be screening for.
So how did you get into the deep dive of mold and fertility in the first place?
Yeah, so I actually didn't myself have any fertility or hormonal challenges, but I got pregnant with my little boy and I tried to prepare for him to have really good gut health because I knew how important it was for kids to be optimizing their gut health. And so I did what I felt like was all the right things. I hadn't taken antibiotics in years. He didn't have any when he was a baby. He was born at home. He was breastfed. And yet when he was about 9 months old, he started getting eczema. And I was very confused about why this was happening, and did all the right things, but I started really doing a deep dive on what was happening not only in his body, but also in my body. And I figured out that it wasn't necessarily a gut health issue that happened, but I had actually transferred all of my toxin burden from the first 30 years of my life to him while he was in utero. And much of that included things like mold and metals that then disrupted his gut health, caused him to have these big eczema flares that were super severe all over his body. And I figured out that it came back to me. So I addressed those things in his body for about a month. His skin cleared. He's never had eczema again, even though people said that wasn't possible. And as I started to do a deep dive on this, thinking about how I transferred that to him, even though I didn't have any fertility challenges, I started thinking about who else is this impacting and how is this impacting women in ways that they might not even know, because I didn't have any symptoms of a mold issue in my health. And so as I started looking at the research and different organ systems that mold and metals and different toxins can ultimately be affecting, I started to realize how important this was for hormonal health and for the ability to conceive, especially for women and couples who are being labeled with things like unexplained infertility or are chasing hormonal imbalances and not really getting the results that they're looking for. So in doing that, we have built an entire practice around environmental toxicity with a big focus on mold, because it is way more common than people realize, and how we can support that preconception phase to do detoxification that not only means that couples are able to conceive more easily, but it means that their pregnancies are healthier, they get the birth outcomes that they're looking for, and children aren't starting day one of life with this inherited toxin burden as well.
So many light bulbs going off. I know today's topic is primarily on addressing women's health and the fertility side of things, but we have to dive into for a moment your son and eczema, because that is a huge issue that I hear amongst friends and even amongst some patients who are like, and I'm seeing the mom, right? But they're like, I do everything correct, just like you. I had a home birth. I all of these things. Why does my kid have eczema? So how did you clear it for your son?
Kind of as an aside, we do also have a pediatric practice. We kind of have a practice that is split into a preconception and a pediatric practice because, as you might imagine, as I started sharing my son's story, I had a lot of parents come out and say, can you help me too? My son, my child has this issue as well. And so we have a really big pediatric practice on that side of things. And what we do is we're really looking at stool testing and toxin testing. And that's exactly what I did for my son as well, is I looked at what was actually happening in his gut microbiome, and then I looked at his toxin burden, and how I had figured out that it had to do with me was I did the same thing for myself as well. And so there were connections and things that weren't the same. And so in looking at those two types of things, we can really see not only what is happening in the gut and causing inflammation that then leads to food sensitivities, immune dysfunction, but then also seeing what the toxin burden is. Because one of the big things that we're really passionate about is toxins are causing dysfunction in the GI tract, and mold plays a really big part in this. But it's not necessarily always that we need to go in and just eradicate pathogens in the gut. That's an important part of things, but unless we know what's contributing to that and creating a susceptibility, which is more the toxin side of things, you often have to go in and do eradication over and over again, which is why you see parents doing things like candida cleanses or parasite cleanses or doing antimicrobials on their children with eczema and having to do it over and over again because they begin to overgrow. So when I think about pathogens as a whole, they are trying to protect us and keep us safe, and they're a normal part of our internal ecosystem. And so when they are overgrowing, there's a reason, and we just need to figure out why that is.
For sure. And do you often find that it is because of mold in the home or in other hidden areas?
It can be both. So it can be in the home. It is most commonly in the home if it is, but it can also be in places like daycare, school, even vehicles is another big one, honestly, because people often leave their windows down, it rains, the car gets wet, and then mold has a susceptibility to grow. But the other big one is that in utero transfer. So a lot of babies in particular that we see start having eczema either from day one of life, or it starts somewhere between 3 and 6 months, even before food has been introduced. And that tells us more that it's typically more of an in utero transfer that's happening. But that being said, when we're doing testing for mold, we're always considering, could this possibly be an issue in your home? Because mold is one of those things I think that people imagine that it's, the black mold growing up your drywall, and it rarely is that. It's always hidden, it's hard to find, and that's really what we try to work through with clients, knowing that we have a lot of experience with actual mold testing and inspection and remediation and figuring all of that out.
Yes. So if light bulbs are going off for somebody who is like, I think I need to get my home tested for mold, where's the starting point? What do you recommend?
Yep. So we typically recommend doing an EMA test, which is from a company called Real Time Labs. This is a little bit different than what people often hear, which is an ERMI test. Both are great tests. The reason that we recommend an EMA test is it is actually the only test on the market that tests both for fungal count, so the actual mold spores, as well as mycotoxins. And mycotoxins are the poisonous substance that mold produces that actually makes us sick. And so because it tests for both of those, you kind of get an error-proof test. It's a dust sample test, so you're going to collect dust around your home, but the nice thing about the EMA test is you can also submit a sample that's 2 inches by 2 inches out of your HVAC filter, so that if there is something that's going through that filter, we're going to catch it no matter where it is in the home. And HVAC systems are one of the most common invisible sources of mold because they can become humid, dust gets stuck in there, it's dark, things can start to grow. And so when we look at that, sometimes we'll see that fungal count will come up and you'll actually see what type of mold, which is important. But if you don't, you also get a second look at mycotoxins. And if you find that there are very dangerous mycotoxins there, which are a category called trichothecenes, if we see that those trichothecenes are present, it tells us that even if you don't see the fungal count, you just missed it on your testing. You didn't actually catch it in that sample. So it's a nice little double check to make sure that there isn't something there if it is something that you're concerned about. So that's usually a really good first step. The obvious problem with doing this type of testing is it doesn't tell you where the problem is. So when I'm helping people think about screening for their home, I'm thinking not only looking for mold. Mold can also be the mildew that grows in the grout of your bathroom, right? That is ultimately a semi-permeable surface where something behind the tile can be coming through the grout. But we're also looking for water damage anywhere. Mold requires water, and so we're thinking about sink leaks, appliances that have leaked, the roof, your basement flooded at some point in time, a window got left open, things like that. And so we're looking for more like clues with water damage than overt mold a lot of times.
Okay, so helpful. And this is like a national company that you recommend sending in the samples to?
Yep, you can order them online and go straight to their website to get that.
Okay, that's really helpful because I love supporting local, like 110%, but there's so much variability and you don't know the quality in terms of the testing, because I do know that there can be a lot of misinterpreted readings when it comes to mold, for one way of putting it. And so this kind of very like trusted, okay, like let's see what the breakdown is and then go from there. That makes a lot of sense. Now, let's say the client gets the readings back and they do have mold. What is the next step?
Yeah, so if you have mold in your home, if you know where it is, that kind of speeds up the process.
Sure.
If you don't know where it is, the next step would be to hire an inspector. And this can be where it gets very tricky because much like practitioners, not all inspectors are created the same. and they have a lot of different educations. We're really looking for what's called an IEP, and we're looking for somebody who's a building biologist. Those people are going to be able to spot issues in the home, even if there is not an overt mold issue, even if they don't see water damage. So they're going to be using a more wide array of tools. It's not just a visual inspection, though the visual inspection is a big part of it. This is somebody who is coming into your home typically for hours, not for half an hour, to do a simple test, like an air test. And they are going to be using things like moisture meters, infrared cameras to see if there is any moisture or heat or cold or dampness in your walls. They're looking in the attic, on the roof, through every room, around every window, behind your appliances, everything. It's a very extensive process. They're going to help you identify areas that there might be a water source or a leak that was missed that you just didn't know about. But they're also going to be able to help write the scope of what needs to happen in order to fix a mold issue when it is found. So from there, you would need a remediation team. And a remediation team is different than an inspector, and ideally they are not the same person. This is a really important thing in the industry because if you have an inspector who is writing the scope of work, they are going to potentially up the work because they're making money off of doing the remediation, right? And so then you want to have a remediation team come in, and they're going to be following very specific guidelines to be safe and ensure that when they are pulling mold out, they're then not contaminating the home further. So there's a set of guidelines called the S520 guidelines. Anybody can look these up online, but they go through what should be happening in terms of containment of the area, what type of protective gear should these people be wearing when they're doing this work to ensure that it makes sense that they understand the danger level of being exposed to these molds as well, and then what they're doing in the aftermath to ensure that they took care of the issue as well. So it's a really extensive process. It can be expensive, but not always. And I think that's the biggest thing that can feel really overwhelming for people when they're thinking about testing their home and like, what does this mean in terms of like the financial commitment? And what I usually explain is when I'm thinking about remediation, it's a big umbrella term. So we're thinking about removing the mold source, and that is the non-negotiable that needs to happen. Right. But then the other side of remediation is the cleanup afterwards. And the cleanup is really the expensive part. A lot of that can be done more like DIY. Sometimes it's on a varying scale of what needs to happen home to home as well. So it's really important that we figure out, like, is there an issue in the home? Because if there is something that you're continuously being exposed to, it disrupts so many different systems in the body, and it impacts everybody in the home differently, even if not everybody is symptomatic.
Yes. So let's dive into those different systems. So we know like an outcome can be external signs of eczema, unexplained infertility, but other kind of hidden root causes that you may find from mycotoxins. What would those be?
Yeah. So one of the most common ones is some level of GI dysfunction. Mold impacts the gut in a variety of different ways. It can change the way that you're able to chemically digest food, so it changes your ability to produce stomach acid. It changes the pancreas's ability to produce enzymes for carbohydrate, chemical digestion. It can also slow down motility. So for some people, it changes the way that the brain and the gut communicate. So it slows down motility through the GI tract, contributing to things like constipation that's really stubborn and doesn't make sense. But it also creates the susceptibility for dysbiosis in the GI tract. So that can look like a fungal overgrowth in the GI tract. So if you've done stool testing and you're seeing that there's a candida issue, it's always important to rule out, is this actually a mold issue and not just candida? But it can also create secondary infections like bacterial overgrowths, whether that's just a normal bacterial overgrowth or something like SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And it can create susceptibility for parasites to overgrow as well. So knowing that parasites are a normal part of the GI tract and we need them, they are protective in many ways. They also start to overgrow in the system when there is a toxicity like mold in an attempt to keep us safe from those mycotoxins circulating and causing more damage. And then the other big way that mold can impact the GI tract is it directly causes leaky gut and intestinal permeability. So you're more likely to have food sensitivities, food allergies, inflammation that really doesn't make sense in the GI tract as well. Knowing that somewhere between 70 and 80% of the immune system lives in the GI tract, it's safe to say that the immune system also gets impacted as well. So we see a lot of immune dysregulation, and this can really show up in a variety of different ways depending on the person. So mycotoxins are immunotoxic, so they can actually cause a compromised immune system, which means that if you're looking at blood work, you might see things like low white blood cell count for one thing, but it can also cause kind of immune chaos. And so, for instance, with children, we'll see something where kids are having a lot of allergies. They're allergic to a lot of different foods that don't really make sense in their family. And that's because what happens is the immune system starts to flag things that are otherwise benign, but it can't deal with any other immune challenges. And so we'll see IgE allergies on paper, oftentimes, usually for kids, but the same can happen for adults, where they don't necessarily make sense or they have never had that type of reaction before, and it's really just an immune dysfunction issue. On kind of like the fertility side of things, we see that the immune system is really compromised, or there's a lot of inflammation happening in the immune system, where the immune system is really important when we're thinking about fertility because it has to fluctuate as we go through the trimesters of pregnancy. And especially in that first trimester, it can make it very challenging to actually conceive and mount an appropriate immune response. So sometimes we'll see on more advanced testing that women have elevated natural killer cells, or they have low Tregs, or their immune system balance is totally off kilter. And so we're thinking about what is actually causing that. So that's the gut and immune health, but then we're thinking about the other hormones too. So not just sex hormones, but even the thyroid as well is a really important one. So mycotoxins can even block enzymes that are needed to convert the inactive form of T4 into T3 so that cells can actually use it. So what happens is it can look like hypothyroidism or subclinical hypothyroidism, but it can also trigger autoimmunity in the thyroid in particular. So we can be thinking primarily about Hashimoto's, but it can also be Graves'. And so we'll see a lot of symptoms like cold hands and feet, lots of hair loss, weight gain that doesn't make sense, especially when you're doing all the same things in terms of diet and lifestyle. But it can also impact the adrenal glands as well and your cortisol. So it can create that dysfunction in the immune system, and it keeps the immune system activated. So it's just sending a danger signal to the brain at all times. And so as a response, those adrenal glands start to pump out more cortisol nonstop. And so eventually it gets very hard to continue to do that. And they downregulate and get really low. So you're real tired, just totally fatigued, don't feel like you used to. And this often gets written up as that's just your job and being an adult and getting older, but it's really what's happening internally in the body creating stress as well. So I know that's a lot. It can cause all sorts of system dysfunction. Those are some of the most common ones we see though.
Yeah, for sure. And, if you're listening to this and you're like, okay, I've been told I have hypothyroidism or, adrenal dysregulation, and I don't know why. This, when we're talking about root cause, could be a root cause, right? And I think that's so important to recognize, is we always have to ask ourselves the question, why? Like, why is my body showing these symptoms? What is it responding to in my environment that kind of pulled the trigger on my body responding in this way? And so mold is one root cause factor. And that's exactly why we're diving into this today, because it's often overlooked. It's not something that's regularly brought up at an appointment of, has your home been tested for mold,
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And not everybody has really overt symptoms. So I think this is another big misconception, especially in the fertility space, is there is a category of women in particular who are being impacted by mold who do have symptoms. And unfortunately, in the fertility space, there are kind of blinders to just the reproductive system when it comes to you're having trouble conceiving or you have recurrent miscarriages. We're just going to look at just what's happening in the ovaries and the uterus. And fertility is really the pinnacle of health. And so when we see that something is going wrong there, we have to look beyond the reproductive system. Yes, there are things happening there, but to your point, why is that happening in the first place? And sometimes women do have symptoms like the GI dysfunction. They have hypothyroidism that they're aware of. They have an autoimmune condition. They have a lot of inflammation. Even some women have dysregulated blood sugar that they think is something that they're just chasing from diet and lifestyle. But one of the things that mold does is it impacts the liver in a big way. So this can lead to the inability to manage blood sugar effectively as well, even if you're doing all the right things. And then there's this other category of women who have no symptoms. They feel great. They love their jobs. They're busy. They're like, I'm perfectly healthy, but I can't get pregnant or I can't sustain a pregnancy. And there's no overt clues. And yet still, when we look at testing them for mold, they have a very significant burden, which sometimes is in their home, and they're just handling it really well.
Before we dive back into today's episode, I want to make sure you don't miss something really special happening this week. It's Black Friday Deal Week here at Holistically Well. 5 full days of my most meaningful offers of the entire year. These are the resources and support I wish every woman had access to as she navigates the sacred seasons of womanhood. And this week, they're available at the lowest prices you'll see. Each day comes with a brand new deal, from holistic programs to exclusive wellness support to one-on-one programming you can use throughout 2026. If you want instant access to all 5 offers, just DM me BF Week, all one word, on Instagram, and I'll send everything straight to your inbox. You can also check the show notes for the direct link to view our 5 days of deals and begin planning for your favorites. These offers only last through Cyber Monday, and when they're gone, they're gone. So if you've been feeling the nudge to step into deeper healing, stronger habits, or truly personalized care, this is the perfect time to begin. All right, let's get back into today's show. So we've discussed mold remediation and if the trigger for the mold toxicity in your body is in your current environment, what to do. If an individual was exposed to mold earlier in life, perhaps such as in your case where it's in their body, it's not fully detoxed from their body, but they're not acutely being exposed to it, what do you do in those instances?
Yeah, so one of the things that can happen is something called colonization. And colonization is when you are exposed to mold, maybe sometime in the past. So mold is a fungus, it produces spores, and we inhale those spores. They also land on our food, we eat them, things like that. When that happens, the fungus starts to live in the body and produce those mycotoxins from the inside out. So we become the moldy building, even if we are no longer living in an environment where there is an active mold situation. So sometimes this can cause symptoms right away, and they slowly start to build over time where you have more and more issues. Now, when that happens, it requires that, we always recommend doing urine testing for mycotoxins, and this is really important for a number of reasons. Not all molds produce the same mycotoxins. So knowing what mycotoxins you are excreting via the urinary tract tells us more about what type of mold you have been exposed to. This can be helpful if we are screening a home that you're currently living in because molds have different fuel sources and grow in different places. Some require constant water source, some don't. So it can really help us pinpoint where should we be looking for this. Even if it's a past exposure, it's still important to know because not all mycotoxins are bound by the same things. And so rather than making an educated guess and throwing spaghetti at the wall and picking a binder that might work for most mycotoxins, it's really helpful to know exactly what we're dealing with so that when we're selecting binders to support detoxification and mopping up these toxins for elimination, it's really designed to be bio-individual and ensure that it's going to work effectively. Those mycotoxins also go down different detox pathways in the liver, so it tells us more about what needs to be supported in order for that to happen not only safely, but comfortably as well.
So let's discuss getting rid of these toxins, right? Like getting them out of our body. Now, I want to cover both preconception, but then also during pregnancy, because I think it's so important that we focus on the preconception end of things because once an individual is pregnant, now we have to think of you and baby. And so I have had patients who come in, they're like, I'm doing this detox and they're pregnant. I'm like, oh, no. We don't want to detox right now because we don't want to mobilize those toxins into our bloodstream and pass them on to baby, right? So let's break that out into those two categories. At first, if somebody is preconception, how can they help detox their body from mycotoxins?
Yep. So preconception is always where we start, and I completely agree with you. So I would say pregnancy and breastfeeding are 2 seasons of life where it just doesn't make sense to do detoxification because we don't want to be transferring anything at greater rates to our baby. So in the preconception phase, we usually recommend as you are leading up to thinking about starting a family or growing your family to be thinking about 6 to 12 months out, just so you have plenty of time. It doesn't necessarily take that long to do detoxification, but there's a big planning aspect to it. And I know it takes time and commitment and all those things. So usually when we're putting together protocols to support detoxification, they're going to be between 4 and 6 months. What that means is we're really thinking about systemically doing things in the right order to ensure that we're thinking about your bio-individual needs, what type of toxins are there, and then moving through things to ensure that by the time we get to the end, nothing is growing back and causing more issues. That always is going to start with supporting drainage and detoxification. So having daily bowel movements. If you're not, how can you support that? Whether it's through hydration, adequate fiber intake, do you need to use something like a stimulant or a laxative? And it can be something like a magnesium oxide, a magnesium glycinate. Those can be incredibly helpful for getting things moving rather than something like a Miralax, just to be moving and making sure that you're actually eliminating anything that is in your body. Then thinking about the liver and the gallbladder. These are incredibly important organ systems for supporting detoxification. There's so much that people can do at home in terms of things like castor oil packs, or if they're interested in doing coffee enemas. Anybody can figure out what type of herbs are going to be supportive for liver function as well. So things like milk thistle and dandelion. You can do these in tea form, you can do them in supplement form. It really just depends on what's happening for you. When we're thinking about supporting liver function in particular, we're also thinking about what's happening from a blood chemistry perspective. So what's happening with liver enzymes and liver function? How are you breaking down fats? Because that's a liver function as well. So we can really personalize it there, but there's so much that you can do at home without that data. And then thinking about the kidneys. So really staying hydrated is a big one, but also including electrolytes in your water to ensure that you're actually cellularly hydrated. Thinking about cell membrane health, so fatty acids in particular can be incredibly helpful to ensure that your cells are not actually rigid, because cells can become rigid when there is a toxic state in the body, and they need to be more flexible in order to let go of those cells, or those toxins as well. And then thinking about just general immune health and screening your environment. So if there is something that you're concerned about, testing early can be incredibly helpful. From there, we're really thinking about what's happening in the GI tract, what's happening in the immune system, figuring out those mycotoxin burdens so that you can hand select binders to do that. All of that really starts, and the big focus is that drainage phase. So even if you're not doing testing, you have no intent of doing like binders or antifungals to address that colonization and a fungal issue in the body, that is going to help ensure that you're able to naturally eliminate those things, and it goes a really long way. As you mentioned, I'm an author. I have a book called Toxic Infertility. There's a ton of information in there in terms of like what you can actually do to support your liver, how to do things like castor oil packs, coffee enemas, how to pick herbs that are going to be supportive there so that you can get that underway, because that is really going to make the biggest difference. So that's kind of what we're thinking about with preconception. On the pregnancy side, it gets a lot more tricky because we don't want to be doing detoxification during that time. So typically what I recommend is, if you think that there could be something in your home, to test your home and get it figured out and taken care of. That's going to be the most bang for your buck to ensure that you are not consistently being exposed to mycotoxins. Not to alarm anybody if they think that this is the case for them, but mycotoxins can transfer over the placenta, and so they can directly impact baby in utero as well if there is a consistent exposure happening. So we do see this often where mom is pregnant, knows that there's a mold issue, doesn't realize how big of a deal it is until baby is born, and now we see that they have a mold illness presentation. So addressing that in the home is huge. From there, I always emphasize lowering stress levels. I think this is not talked enough about in the pregnancy space, where we just have to lower stress. There is only so many things that we can do while you are pregnant, and lowering your stress levels, regulating your nervous system, decreasing cortisol as much as possible is going to help ensure that the same happens for baby. So again, cortisol transfers over the placenta, baby's cortisol levels are elevated too, and they have a stress response too. So knowing that there's only so much that we can do during that time, it's really about, is there a source? Let's remove it. Just continuing to eat a healthy diet, rich in antioxidants. One of the big things that mold does is cause oxidative stress throughout the body. Antioxidants are going to be the cure for that. They're going to help neutralize all of those things. So just focusing on a really healthy diet, lots of fatty acids, are going to really help ensure that if there is something that you've been exposed to, even if you do know that there is a mold issue in your body, that it's going to be mitigated as much as possible. And not all children who have a mom that was exposed to mold have health issues, is the other big thing. We just don't know until baby starts to grow and develop. And those things can always be addressed in the future if needed. The thing with children is a little bit different than adults, is kids are so resilient and they tend to bounce back so much faster than adults do. So just know that if that is the case, they are not doomed. Those things can be reversed. They can be detoxed very effectively and very quickly so that they don't have lifelong health issues as well.
I love that positive mindset because, it's very typical that if you bring this question to an OBGYN, like you're going to be told, oh, there's nothing you can do during pregnancy. Like we'll just focus on it after the back, or like, don't worry about that. Like you gave practical, actionable steps that women can take right now. They're like, I am pregnant, but I also think I have a mold issue in my home. Like, what can I do? Go back, re-listen to that snippet, take some notes, and enact that right away. Like those are such easy steps to take. And then just having the knowledge that when your child is growing and you maybe see eczema pop up, or they're extra tired compared to their peers, or things like that, your light bulb might be going off of, oh, maybe this is from mold and that transfer that was exposed in utero. And then you can get testing and go down that path. If they're developing normally and there's no outward signs, okay, great. You have nothing to worry about. But to not stress yourself out now, because to Deidre's point, stress is going to do the exact opposite of what we want as you're growing this new life. And that is the same for preconception, right? Stress is going to have no positive effect when it comes to optimizing our fertility. Managing our stress optimally is so important because stress is a part of life, but how we respond to it is so important.
Absolutely.
So you have walked women through this journey of unexplained infertility and coming to you with just questions, right? Can you share a story or two of someone who wasn't ovulating or wasn't able to sustain pregnancy or had recurrent loss, and what shifted once mold exposure was addressed?
There's one woman I'm thinking about. She was in her late 30s. I want to say she was 37 years old, and she had recently gotten married. They'd been trying to conceive for just under a year, but she just felt like something was off. And part of that was that she was actually barely having a period at that time. It was really light, and she was like, this just doesn't feel right. Now, in going through her health history with her, we figured out a lot of different things. One of which was that she had been taking hormonal birth control for a long period of time, and that was impacting what was happening from the way that her brain was to be able to communicate with the ovaries and therefore hormones to come back online. But the other big thing was that she had a lot of digestive symptoms and had some strange things happening in her health that nobody had really asked any questions about. So one of which was she had a C. diff infection at one point in time. She was prescribed antibiotics for that, which is completely normal and sometimes necessary. When that happened, she also started having a lot of digestive upset where she just couldn't eat anything. She was really nauseous, and she ended up being diagnosed with gastroparesis and put on medication for gastroparesis to help manage it. And so if you don't know, gastroparesis is basically where the contents of the stomach when you eat don't empty at an appropriate rate. So you just feel really full and nauseous, and foods aren't digesting because they're not moving into the intestines the way that they're supposed to. And so she was put on a medication that helped. However, one of the things that her medication did was change the way that her body was producing hormones in the pituitary, and they were actually impacting the communication to her ovaries as well. So it was blocking ovulation in a big way. That was thing number one. So we talked about how do we actually resolve the digestive system so that that medication is no longer needed and you can work with your prescribing physician to come off of that. So in doing testing, we looked at what was happening in her GI tract. We looked and tested her for mold because mold can often cause that gastroparesis. But the other thing that was happening is a couple of years prior to that whole digestive saga is that she had actually fainted randomly. And she fell so hard that she fell and broke her jaw. And nobody knew why. They were just like, we don't know, you just fainted. It could be anything. And she thought for a long time that maybe it had to do with her blood sugar, or, she noticed that she just felt really weird and felt like she was going to faint when she would consume alcohol. And so she stopped doing those things, started focusing on her blood sugar, but it still kept happening where she was fainting, but she could feel it coming on, and it was never as severe after that. So as we started looking at things, we ended up finding mold. It was not currently in her home, which was a good thing. It was something that happened in the past. She was like, yep, when I was younger, before I got married, I was living somewhere. It was old. It probably had mold. That makes sense. So we started addressing those things in her body. And as we did that, not only did her digestive system improve, she stopped having the gastroparesis symptoms. She was able to come off of her medication, so that was not blocking ovulation any longer as well. And then she was actually able to chemically digest food. She was deficient in a lot of different nutrients like iron and vitamin D, and all of those are really important for hormone health and fertility as well. And as a result, she then started getting her period back. And when she discontinued care with us at 6 months, she was like, we'll probably start trying to conceive here in the next couple months. 2 months later, she sends a message and she was like, I can't believe it. I'm pregnant. We weren't even really trying. I can't believe this because, like 8 months ago, I didn't even have a period. And so to go that fast into that side of things where she might have otherwise just been told, we don't know what's going on with your hormones. You have basically one option, which would be IVF, and that just didn't sit well for her. She was like, there's got to be a reason that this is happening. And then bringing into everything else that was happening in her body was super helpful for connecting all the dots to ensure that we were doing the right testing and going in the right direction to bring all of that back online as well.
Amazing. And as you said earlier, fertility is the peak of optimal health for women. And so when a recommendation is to go straight to IVF, it's like we are not addressing the root cause when that happens. Like there is a reason, an underlying reason that we're not ovulating or the reproductive hormones aren't doing what they should, etc. And to sustain pregnancy, those things are also needed. So what a gift to, her and just to all of you listening, if your only option is being presented as IVF, is to understand there are other options out there. And not only is it going to affect your reproductive system, but all of these other systems of your body, your immune system, your gut, your digestion, like everything to keep you feeling good overall.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the big things that we're always thinking about too is like, we want kids to be healthy as part of this process as well, and that starts in the preconception phase.
Right.
But if there's other things happening in your body outside of reproduction, we also want you to be a healthy and thriving parent when it comes.
Yes.
Because anybody who has little kids knows they take a lot of energy. And so we want you to feel really good through that process as well. And doing that work ahead of time is really important. I've never had a mom on the other side realizing that in utero transfer happened, not say to me, I wish I knew this before I got pregnant.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, sometimes there's a reason biologically why our body isn't reproducing. And, this is one reason why, right? And to your point of wanting you to be an optimal, healthy parent, to be able to show up for your children, well, that's oftentimes why, if our body is not in a good state of health, then biologically it knows like we can't support reproduction, we can't sustain pregnancy, and we can't optimally show up for our future children, right? So getting that all in order before you even become pregnant is like the gold standard and what I hope that we can both help people achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say too, if you're in a position like me where you're like, oh no, I bet this happened and like my child has health issues, you can always go back and do things for your health. Like we were talking about earlier, we just don't want to do it during pregnancy or breastfeeding, but between children or when you're done having children, that's a really great time to like take a step back and really focus on like what's happening there, because these things are also going to continue to impact you for the rest of your life. If you had hormonal issues preconception, the same is going to be true as you transition through menopause as well. So it doesn't just stop with fertility.
I'm so glad you brought up breastfeeding too, because would you say the same recommendations you gave for somebody during pregnancy holds true for breastfeeding?
Yes, absolutely. The same things are true. There is a little bit more flexibility depending on how old the child is, but typically children under the age of 1 who are still breastfeeding, we don't recommend doing any detoxification. One of the things that we often don't realize is that breast milk is actually a drainage pathway. Now, while there can be toxins that are transferred via breast milk, and this kind of gets in women's heads sometimes of like, maybe I should stop. If I have a mold issue, I'm transferring mycotoxins, which is possible. The other thing to keep in mind is that there are so many benefits when it comes to breastfeeding. So even if there is a toxicity in the body, the immune system and the way that children are nourished via breast milk far outweighs that toxin drainage. So while it can be tempting to stop, and I was certainly in the same position of like, should I stop? Do I keep going? What's best for my child? And being willing to make that choice. It's always best to continue until mom and or baby are ready to discontinue, and then we can look back at what's happening for mom. When children are a little bit older and you are doing more extended breastfeeding, then there's a little bit more that we can do, but it still needs to be extremely gentle. And we're always monitoring what's happening in mom's body and how she's responding, as well as baby as well. And I would just say, if you are thinking about doing that, it's really important to work with somebody so they can kind of guide and coach you on what should that be looking like, what is not considered safe. Because I think that there is a lot of misinformation on what you can do when you have an older child breastfeeding. And some women just push it a little bit too far, and we don't want to be doing any harm to our kids.
For sure. For sure. No, that's super helpful. I'm glad that we brought that up. Before we wrap things up here, I did want to ask how toxin exposure can burden the body before it even touches the reproductive hormones. So, what would some of those early signs be that something might be off in regards to mold exposure?
Yeah, so some of the most common ones that we see are going to be something happening with the neurological system. So think your brain, but also your nerves throughout your whole body. We commonly see a lot of brain fog or headaches that don't really make sense. So if you're like, I'm hydrating, I'm eating well throughout the day, why do I have this headache every day? That can be a sign that there's something going on with mold. It can also be that brain fog where you're just having trouble finding words or you're mixing up words. Sometimes you'll find that you're walking into a room more and you don't know why you went in there. On really severe circumstances, people will be driving and kind of forget where they're going or forget how to come home. So I'm really thinking about the way that the nervous system is being impacted. And part of that has to do with the fact that mycotoxins are very small substances, and they are actually smaller than the alveoli in our lungs. So when we breathe them in, that means that they don't have that barrier and they go directly into the bloodstream. When that happens, these mycotoxins are neurotoxic and they can go to the brain and cause a lot of neurological dysfunction. And that's one of the most common things that you're going to see happen because of how sensitive the brain is. But if you're also starting to notice changes in digestion that are kind of out of the ordinary, I wouldn't stress out if they are more of an acute issue, but you're noticing like, are these things long-standing? Are those things starting to change? Do I get sick a lot? Is another common one where people are really sick, especially during a certain time of year. So think about the winter. When you spend more time indoors, you have your windows closed, you're not going outside for fresh air, and you're getting sick back to back to back to back, and you just can't seem to get ahead of it. That can be a sign that the immune system is really trying to fight something off within the body, and there could be something like mold happening. So those are some of the most common ones that we see, and those tend to happen long before we get to the point of seeing hormonal or fertility concerns, but they tend to be more subtle and the more easy things to write off as like, it's just something happening, or it's just winter and I get sick all the time, or whatever it is.
Right. So just important things to keep in mind as you think of mold, just in the background of your mind as a potential root cause of some of these issues, right? So remembering that from today's conversation, mold can hide in plain sight. Sometimes it isn't that, aggressive black mold that you see on the basement wall. Sometimes it can be mold spores in your air, looking in your HVAC system, knowing that there are companies that you can send samples into to get this tested to even see if it's an issue within your own home. And then to understand that mold impacts not just estrogen and progesterone, our reproductive hormones, but it affects our thyroid, our adrenals, and that entire hormone cascade, as well as our gut, our digestive system, and our immune system. And that testing and addressing this exposure can restore fertility, but also improve whole body health and wellness, which is so important for that overall health. If you've been told that you have unexplained infertility or your labs look, quote, normal, but something just feels off, maybe you're experiencing the brain fog Deidre mentioned or some of those earlier signs, to not ignore your inner voice, knowing that digging deeper truly can lead to that root cause, and just understanding that there are resources out here to support you, such as Deidre and her team. So Deidre, where can listeners find you, connect, get your book, or work with you or your team?
Yeah, so you can find us on Instagram. We do a lot of really in-depth education. I'm an educator at heart, so I try to go beyond what a lot of people are doing in the education space. Our handle there is Reversing Infertility. Our website is always-growing.com. Our practice is called Always Growing Wellness. You can find us by searching that as well. And then you can find my book, Toxic Infertility, on Amazon. It's available in softcover as well as a Kindle edition.
So awesome. Well, thank you for tuning in as always. And if this episode resonated with you, if you had any light bulb moments, please leave a review for Holistically Well. Let us know what spoke to you the most. We both love educating on these important topics surrounding fertility, but also whole body health. And your reviews, your comments really do help us know where to steer the ship and where to dig deeper into so that we can optimally support you and your health. So we'll see you again next Tuesday here on Holistically Well.